Hey folks, welcome to Fiveable's presentation tonight for APUSH on the DBQ for period 4. We're going to jump into lots about the DBQ, and if you go into the resources for this, this is Frankie who's going to make his appearance. If you go into the resources for this stream, there's a Google Doc with the documents we'll be using to analyze. I'll be putting them up on the screen as well, but I thought it also might be easier if you had a Google Doc that you could go off of, so you would have the documents in front of you all the time instead of just as we're looking at each individual document. So feel free to open up that Google Doc when I go through this beginning part. So as always, on social media, you can get us at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Great spots to ask us questions. Or if you have suggestions for topics you think we should cover or things you would like to learn more about, it's always a great place to put that on social media. Coming up as far as APUSH is concerned, next week on the 11th at 7 o'clock, it will be putting period 5 into context. And then on the 14th at 7 o'clock, it'll be Antebellum America, and these are both Central Times. So leaving period 4 and jumping into period 5, I know that's what I just started period 5 the other day with my students in my class, and getting into everything about leading us up to the Civil War. So that's starting us off next week with APUSH. So as far as tonight, we're going to look at the DBQ. We're going to start off kind of simple and just talk about some tips, what the rubric looks like and how you can get those points to accomplish the DBQ, and then we're going to look at practice questions in the sense of I have a bunch of documents, I have a DBQ question, which we're going to try to kind of look at and write a DBQ together. Obviously, in an hour's time, we're probably not going to be able to write an entire DBQ, but we can look at strategies and the best way to outline it and see how far we get with it. So before I jump in, are there any questions before I kind of start looking at the rubric as to how to best do a DBQ? All right, awesome. Feel free as we're going along to ask whatever questions it is that you might have, and I'd be happy to help them, answer them. So as far as the rubric is concerned, the very first thing, I always tell my students in the first paragraph of their DBQ, you can kill 2 points right there and knock them out by putting context in your DBQ in your first paragraph and your thesis statement. So your context wants to link whatever the prompt, whatever the question might be, you want to be able to link that prompt to your thesis statement. I heard an APUSH teacher once say that the best way to think about it is if you've seen Star Wars before, and you've watched that at the beginning of Star Wars, they kind of do that scroll, giving you the setting, telling you kind of what's been going on for the past few years. That's kind of what you want your context to be, right? So you start off by having a general conversation, setting the scene, getting the layout of what's been going on. And then you jump right into, after that, then you connect it and flow right into your thesis statement. Okay, if you do that, you have 2 points right there for your rubric, right? Because now you've set the context, you've set the scene, and now we're moving into our thesis statement. Yeah, when that APUSH teacher said that the one time, I was like, oh, that's the perfect way to explain it. So then you want to move into your thesis statement. Your thesis statement should be historically defensible, right? So you're making an argument that you intend to prove as you're writing your DBQ, and you want to have multiple points, okay? So a lot of times students try to just restate whatever the prompt is, restate the question. You don't want to do that. You want to take a firm stance in your thesis statement so that the reader knows, okay, this student intends to prove whatever it might be. And a part of taking a firm stance is then also saying, these are the ways in which I'm going to prove it. And one of the things we're going to talk about is this whole idea of grouping. And if you can group the documents together and have a common theme and shoot for 3 different groups, that means you would then have 3 different multiple points that you're going to be proving in your thesis. And this will make a little bit more sense when we actually jump into the example I have prepared for you. And then after that, so now if you, again, you've got context and thesis in your first paragraph, you have 2 points and you're on your way. After that, as far as documents are concerned, where you get points for documents, 1 point will be given for describing the document, and you have to describe at least 3 of the documents in order to get this point. For this point, you're not quoting the documents, right? Because that's not describing them. You need to make sure you're using in your own words to explain what exactly the point or the context of that document might be. What's the content in that document? What is the writer of that document trying to say? Okay, so I know a lot of times students like to quote. You really want to stay away from quoting because sometimes it makes you feel as though you're earning the point, but you're really not. So again, for describing, you have to do it with 3 of the documents. Supporting, you need to do this with 6 of the documents, where you support an argument in response to the prompt. So now you've described the content of the document. Now you got to kind of say, well, how does this document support that argument I'm trying to make? How does it connect back to my thesis statement? How does it connect back to the prompt itself? And then explain, at least for my students, this is where they have the most difficult time. When it comes to, you need to explain 3 documents. And in order to explain 3 documents, where they get confused is sometimes what's the difference between explaining and describing. Explaining is taking it beyond the basic, this is what the document is about. Explaining is showing that you understand there's more to the document than exactly what is being said, right? What the literal document is saying. That's what description is. Literally, what is this document about? Explanation is analyzing it now. So we can do it through POV, meaning point of view. A great way of looking at point of view is thinking to yourself, oh, is this somebody's diary writing? Because if this is somebody's diary writing, right, if they're writing in a journal, this is their personal, private point of view. Or if I'm looking at something that maybe Thomas Jefferson wrote, I'm going to be thinking to myself, okay, well, Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. So as a Democratic Republican, you know, his point of view is going to be skewed towards wanting to promote agriculture and wanting to promote states' rights, okay? So whenever you're trying to do point of view, you want to be able to connect some sort of fact about the author of that document to explain why their point of view is the way it is. So some facts could be, again, what's their political party? You could say a fact might be what their position within the government is. You know, Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, has this point of view because. Also, you could look at, to get this point, if you don't want to do point of view, you could look at what's the purpose of the document. You know, if it's FDR going before Congress to ask for a declaration of war, and that's the document that we're reading, what was the purpose of him going before Congress? You can look at the historical situation. You know, what's the context of which this document was written? Just don't make the mistake of thinking to yourself, if you're doing historical situation for a document, that counts for that first initial point of getting context, because it doesn't, right? You can't use one scenario and think you can get multiple points for it. Everything needs to be separate. Or you could look at the audience of the document. Who is this document being written for? And then explain that when you're talking about the document. And you have to do it for 3 of the documents in order to get that point. Let me just switch slides here. The next part to get a point is to bring in outside evidence. So this is where you want to bring in something that is not included in the documents, something that shows you have an understanding of the time period, an understanding of the issue that's being discussed. You know, for instance, in period 3, my students and I were looking at a DBQ, and one of the parts of the DBQ was talking about, you know, women's rights and social changes during the Constitutional Convention. And so there were a couple of documents from women So when my students had grouped that together within that paragraph, then they also talked about Abigail Adams and how she had written to her husband, remember the ladies. There was no document from Abigail Adams, but it connected to the whole idea of social changes for women during the Constitutional Convention. And so they were able to bring in this concept of Abigail Adams, which would be considered outside evidence. And then one piece of specific evidence to support the argument, and this outside evidence, again, one piece of specific evidence to support the argument can't be found in the documents, and it cannot, again, be used for contextualization. So this has to be separate from that initial point where you went for contextualization. And then, again, this is something my students also find difficult, and this is something that's not only required on the DBQ, but also required with the long essay as well. And it's this whole idea of complex understanding. To demonstrate understanding of nuance, make deep historical connections, put documents in conversation, noting corroboration and contradiction, connect across time and place, put forward alternative viewpoints. So there's a couple different ways in which you can get complex understanding. I always tell the students, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, the easiest way to get the point for complex understanding is to try to connect whatever the gist of the theme of this DBQ is to another time in history when we see a similar theme. So to me, that's the easiest way to get context. Not everyone finds that to be the easiest way, but I think, especially as once you've gotten to the point where you've studied U.S. history for an entire year, you'll see there are so many scenarios in U.S. history that are similar, just taking place in different time periods, that it's easy to make that connection. That would be for 5D where you could get that point. Another way of getting this point is say that the prompt asks you for maybe the economic and political changes that occurred due to whatever it is they're asking you about. If you threw in social changes and made that a part of your thesis and had a full body paragraph dedicated to social changes when they're only asking you for political and economic, you're taking it to another level, that could get you a point for doing that. Also for complex understanding, a point could be, if they're asking you maybe to express just continuity, but then you decide to also bring in a paragraph on change. And again, you put that into your thesis statement. Or they're asking you to show the comparisons, but then you also decide to put in your thesis and then bring in a paragraph contrasting, where you're showing that alternative viewpoint. That can get you the extra point there too. So sometimes, again, it depends on the essay. Sometimes it's easier to do, like, if it's all continuity, bring in change. If it's all comparison, to bring in contrast. Or some students just like to practice doing the same thing all year, so they hone that skill. And that's why some of my students just like to connect across time and place each time, and then they're ready for that when it comes on that final exam in the spring. So those are the basics of how to get the points on the rubric. These are just some other tips and good stuff to know as far as the DBQ is concerned. So the time frame, your DBQ will focus on 1754 to 1980. So you won't see anything before 1754 on your DBQ, and you won't see any topics after 1980 on your DBQ. So that's just good to know as far as where the question might be coming from. It's 7 possible points, which we obviously just went over, all 7 possible points that you can get. It's very important you parenthetically cite your documents. A lot of students like to start off their paragraph by saying, in document 1. Please, 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 please do not do that. When you are done describing and talking about the document, at the end of that sentence, you put in parentheses document 1. So parenthetically cite the documents. Do not ever, ever, ever start off a sentence saying in document and then insert the number. Don't quote the documents. Make a specific reference to the document, but don't quote it. A lot of times, like, you're not going to lose points for quoting it. Let me just clarify. But the reason I tell students not to quote it is because it stops them from making the mistake of thinking, okay, I'm describing it by quoting it, because that's not going to get you that description point. So I just try to steer clear of the quotes and say, just don't quote at all. You won't be penalized for quoting, but I think it'll keep you out of trouble as far as wondering whether or not you're hitting that description point. Group the documents. This will help you, one, write your thesis statement, and two, it's going to help you keep your essay organized and keep your documents collated as far as which documents connect to prove a point. And again, this will make more sense when we actually look at the DBQ we're going to talk about, and we'll look at different ways to group these documents. Why do you say not say in document one? Okay, good question, Ashley. It's just something that the readers don't want. They want you to parenthetically cite the documents. One of the big reasons why is when you start a paragraph, they really want you starting a paragraph with a topic sentence that connects to what is the general argument you're going to be making in this entire paragraph. And then they want you to be using your documents as evidence, which means that after you do your topic sentence, you should then at this point initially start talking about whatever document it is you tend to use, and it flows much better that way. When you start going in document one, this and that, it's kind of sometimes takes you away from actually making the argument you want in that paragraph, because you're not then making connections between the documents, and it more just becomes listing the documents, explaining them, and then moving on. So it's more to save the student. Again, this is a big thing that they look for. Will you be penalized if you parenthetically cite your documents? No, right? If you look at the board, at the rubric, you're not going to be penalized for, well, my students in class are penalized for doing it, but if you look at the rubric, you will not be penalized for doing that. But will it prevent you from maybe having organization and take you away from what you should be doing? Absolutely. So it's just best, it's one of those practices, just like I say, don't quote. It's best to parenthetically cite your documents. Okay, you're welcome, Ashley. Again, begin each paragraph with a topic sentence, and we'll jump into that. Use all 7 documents. You're not required to use all 7 documents. You're required to at least use 6 of them. My suggestion is to use 7. The reason I say use 7 is, again, according to the rubric, there's no points for doing something wrong in a sense, right? So say you use all 7 documents, but you use one of them incorrectly. You're not penalized for that because they just want to see that you're using 6 of them correctly. So I always tell my students, it's better to use 7 and make a mistake, because if you use 6 and make a mistake, then you're out of luck, right? Because you're going to lose a point because now you've only used 5 correctly. So I always say, go for all 7. If you make a mistake, not a big deal. They don't take off a point for that. It's to your betterment to go for all 7. And some just other steps for success that I find helpful to tell students as far as kind of outlining in a sense. You know, that first 15 minutes when you first get to look at that DBQ, you really want to make sure you read and understand the prompt. Make sure you understand what is being asked. If you want to, in your head, kind of restate it in your head just so you know what's going on. Go through all 7 documents and start thinking to yourself as you're going through all 7 documents, how can I put all 7 documents into 3 different groups? What connections might there be amongst these 7 documents that I can fit them into 3 different groups? And then once you have those 3 different groups, at that point in time, you can actually start writing your thesis statement, right? Because it's going to be those 3 groups that are going to lead you to your thesis statement. Again, context and thesis should both be in your initial paragraph. And then we're going to get into your body paragraphs and what they will look like. So let's take a look now. Let me go back to this. So again, there is a Google Doc. If you look at the resources available for this stream, there is a Google Doc that will have all of these different DBQ, all the different documents we're using tonight. I will be putting them up on the screen one by one, but it might be easier for you if you have them all at once. And I'm just going to jump real quick to the end just so we Did I put the question, or I totally didn't even put the question? Hold on 1 second as I open the Google Doc like a dope, so that I can have the question, so then we see exactly what we're doing. So just give me 1 second. DBQ practice. Let's see. Oh, wrong document. Okay, that's not it either. Let's going through my Google Docs here, and there are a lot of things, unfortunately, called DBQ. Oh, here we go. This one will be it. So the question for this that we're going to be answering tonight as we go together. Let's see. No, this. Hold on 1 second. I don't know why this is. I'm just going to go to Fiveable's website, where I have it for all of you, because I can't seem to find it in my Google Docs. Okay, let's sign in. I apologize for this delay here. I need to see. Okay, here. Oh my gosh, DBQ documents. There we go. Okay, so analyze the extent to which political and economic changes reshaped American society between 1820 and 1848. So that's what you want to be thinking about as we do this. What political and economic changes reshaped American society? So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at each of these documents. We're going to read them through. We're going to jot down our description notes as we're going through them, right? And then we're going to see in the end, how can we connect these documents as far as political and economic changes. So this is a document by John Quincy Adams. It's his personal diary from January 8th, 1820. So it's important to note that's his personal diary, because that's important if we want to use for explanation. We can say his audience is basically himself, right? But take a second to read this, and then in the commentary, if anybody wants to just say like how they would describe this document, the description part or anything like that, that would be great. And then we'll just take a second and think about again. I'm going to ask you, once we get through all 7 documents, how we could possibly group all 7 into 3 separate groups. So the one thing, as I just read this document, I would say is, again, we're looking for political and economic changes, right? So I would say, as I'm thinking ahead, okay, if I have to look for documents that are going to fit under political and economic, here he's talking about the houses of Congress and the struggle that takes place between legislative branch, right, and the executive branch. So I would say this is probably going to, if I have to put it into political or economic, I would put it into political. And so right now I'm going to say document 1 looks like it's going to be political. I'm just going to type this to have it on the side for us as we go back. All right, document 2. I'm reading this as we go through. So for document 2, what do you all think? Should we lump this under political or economic? So for document 2, I'm going to say, as we're making our groupings, I'm leaning towards this is going to be economic. And now we'll go to document 3. What do we think about document 3, political or economic? So document 3 as well, I'm going to say, it's looking a little bit more like, to me, I would want to put it into an economic grouping. And for this document, document 4, I mean, it could go either way. But let's say for now we might put it as political, although we might want to change that after we've looked at the other documents. Document 5, almost there. And this is talking a lot about tariffs, right? And it's also talking about the members of Congress. But let's say economic for document 5. Kind of speeding along here just because I'd like to get to the grouping and the thesis development and all of that. And I see we're getting on 8:30 here. Document 6 is looking at U.S. Presidential voting patterns and changes in that. So we're looking at Democratic voters, Republican voters, voters for other parties. So this is looking political. And then one last document, document 7, where we're talking about the Seneca Falls Convention. So this has to do with women's rights. So document 7. Oh, I meant to say political document 6. Sorry. Political document 6. And then here we're going to have political document 7. Now, we see we have our 2 groups that we need to have, right? Because the essay question, the prompt, is specifically asking us for political and economic changes. If you've been here since the beginning of the stream, hopefully you recall I had mentioned that if there is a question where it asks you for political and economic changes, to get that complex understanding point, you actually could throw in a 3rd category, right? And then put it into your thesis and spend a paragraph talking about it to get that complex understanding point. So my suggestion for a DBQ of this magnitude would be not only do the political and economic changes that the DBQ is asking for, but also to throw in social changes to get complex understanding. Okay? So if we reevaluate this and we look at some of these documents, we can easily say document 7 here, which is talking about women's rights and the fact that women don't have the right to vote. And it's talking about all these things, right? Because they made this Declaration of Rights for Women at the Seneca Falls Convention modeled on the Declaration of Independence. So we could easily say, you know what, we could use document 7 for social. And if we go back and look at some of these other documents, so this is changes in U.S. voting patterns, right? Here we have document, where was the, Andrew Jackson, this document 4.1. Here you can kind of see he's a little bit, in a sense, also talking about social changes that are taking place, and what's going on. I mean, it's also a little political as well, but we could make the argument that document 4 could be used in the social category. We could probably also make the argument that document 2, if we wanted to, could be used in the social category, or even going back to this one, we can make the argument about document 6 being used in the social category, because we could talk about the fact that probably some of the reasons we saw changes in the U.S. presidential voting pattern is due to the fact that we saw more democracy, in the sense of most states at this point in time had done away with property requirements. So as long as you were a white male, you were able to vote. So I think the easiest thing for us to do would be document 6 and 7. We're going to use in a paragraph to show our social. We're going to use for political, and I'm typing this all up and I will send it. We're going to use documents 1, document 4, and documents, looks like 1 and 4. And then for economic, we're going to group it together, and we're going to say document 2, 3, and then 5. And now we have all 7 documents are going to be used, right? And we have 3 paragraphs. So we have our 3 body paragraphs. Now all we have to decide is, well, what's going to be our thesis statement, which is probably, hopefully, a lot of times the hardest part, but hopefully at this point in time, because of the fact that we now have our 3 groupings that we're going to use, hopefully we can come up with a thesis statement. So again, the question is, analyze the extent to which political and economic changes reshaped American society between 1820 and 1848. Does anyone want to take a stab at writing a thesis statement and sharing it with us? I'll give you all a second to kind of throw it out there, write a thesis statement. We'll all offer support and advice. This is the best time to do it, right? To try it out here and see if you're on the mark. And again, we're writing this thesis statement with the understanding that these are social, political, and economic are 3 ways of looking at this. I'm going to, as you all are writing a thesis statement, I'm going to be writing one myself that then I will share with you. But I'm hoping that those of you who are in this stream will also write your own thesis statements as well. I don't know if you can tell, but my cat is totally giving me a stare down over here. Social media through So, was she politically banned? I don't want to run on sentence here. Remember, a thesis statement can be one or two. So let's see. Between 1820 and 1848, American society was reshaped politically by interactions between the branches of government and economically, socially, democratization. I can't spell tonight. Occurred for white men while women continued to advocate for more rights. So if I was to do a thesis statement, this would be my thesis statement. I have set forward my 3 points of proof that I intend to prove as I do this DBQ, as I go into writing this DBQ. Whenever you have in a prompt the years, you want to make sure you include the years in your thesis statement. And again, I'm tackling what they specifically asked for in my first sentence by talking about politically and economically what I'm going to discuss. And then I'm tackling the complex understanding point by throwing in a third category that they did not ask for, but that I'm adding in. So I'm taking it to another level that will give me my complex understanding point by looking at things socially and not just politically and economically. Questions about my thesis statement at all? Okay, so remember my first paragraph, not only do I want to have my thesis statement, but I want to start this entire DBQ with context, right? So the context is asking, again, the prompt is saying, analyze the extent to which political and economic changes reshaped American society between 1820 and 1848. I want to spend about 4 to 5 sentences talking about life in the early 1800s. 4 to 5 sentences talking about what life was like prior to 1820. So prior to this time period in which they're asking me about, because then I'm setting the context of getting us into the time of what's going on, right? So I would talk about during, in my context, I'm not going to write this out in a full sentence for the sake of time, but in my context, which is in my first paragraph, what I might discuss at this point in time would be, politically, I might start off by talking about the revolution of 1800, then leading to the emergence of new political parties in the 1820s, right? I might, and again, these aren't going to be complete sentences. Then economically, I might want to discuss, we had Hamilton's financial plan, right? Which was in the late 1700s. And then that took us into the first and then even the second Bank of the United States when it was rechartered. I might want to talk about the emerging economies in the South and North. The South being agriculture, and the North being industry. So I might want to talk about all of this in a nice, clean way, using complete sentences, which is totally what I didn't do. But talk about all that and then lead it into my thesis. So I'm going to do context and thesis in first paragraph. Boom. I have 2 points. Okay, so I have 2 of the 7 points I need on this DBQ rubric. I should feel accomplished already. Now at this point in time, I want to go into my first body paragraph, right? So we always want to start off a body paragraph with a topic sentence. We don't want to just jump into a body paragraph by talking about our documents. So again, let's pick one of these to start off with. Why don't we do the political, which we said we're using documents 1 and 4. If I look at my thesis statement, I said politically I'm going to talk about interactions between the branches of government. And so if we quickly, again, if you go to that Google Doc that I shared with all of you, if you look at document 1, which is John Quincy Adams in his personal diary, where he's basically talking about how both houses of Congress are trying to control the executive branch and trying to take away powers of the president. And then if you look at, what do we say, document 4, which is Andrew Jackson. And here Andrew Jackson is talking about, let's see. So here Andrew Jackson is talking about remember, Andrew Jackson is more of a states' rights person, and so here he's talking about the national government becoming too powerful. So what we want to do here in our first body paragraph, we're going to start with topic sentence before jumping into documents. So our topic sentence here might be, between whatever time periods here, 1820 and where are we going back here? 1848. So between 1820 and, or we don't even have to do that. We'll just jump into, so various disagreements were taking place politically, arguments over the powers between the legislative and executive branches, as well as who holds more power, the states or the federal government, were all being discussed. Okay, so that's my topic sentence for my body paragraph. Now I want to jump into supporting this, the fact that these political changes are taking place. So again, I don't want to say in document so-and-so, so I might say John Adams, while writing in his diary, comments on the power struggle between the legislative branch and the executive branch. John Adams, as president, here I'm getting my point of view, feels that the legislative branch is trying to diminish the role of the president. And this is document 1. So you see how I did that? I described the document by talking about he's arguing about the two branches and their interactions together. And I'm also getting my point of view, my exclamation point, by saying, yeah, John Adams, he's president. So as president, he's going to feel this way, right? Because he feels as though they're trampling on his power. And at the same time, I'm making the connection to support the whole idea that this is a political change that is taking place, right? The fact that, we used to see the president and the Congress working much better together, but now we're not necessarily seeing that. And to kind of support that even more, we might want to bring in, this would be a good place to bring in outside evidence and we could talk about the interaction that maybe we saw between Washington and his Congress, right? So to bring in outside evidence, talk about the relationship between Washington and his Congress, which was much friendlier, right? And so that's showing how the fact that now there's more of a like hitting a wall between the two branches, how that's showing change at this point in time. We only have about 14 or so minutes left, and obviously we've kind of just covered how to do context thesis, and I've kind of showed you how to do description, support, and explain of a document. I want to make this as worthwhile to those of you who are here as possible. So are there any specific questions or specific things you want me to do in this remainder of time to make this the best stream possible for all of you? I'll give you a second to kind of shout out if there is anything specific I can do to make this, or I can just continue, I can obviously easily continue on as well. But if there's something specific you all are looking for, please, as I take a sip of water, I'll give you a second to do that. All right, so I'm just gonna continue on then with kind of the course I'm going. Feel free at any time in these last 10 minutes or so, if something does come up or it's like, I really wish you would go in this direction, just throw it in the comments and I can change course at any. How do we mention a document specifically without quoting it? Oh, great question, Ethan. So it's kind of like what I just did here, right? So this is document 1 being mentioned, and I didn't quote it at all, right? So I talked about the fact that John Adams, right? So if we look at document 1, it's from John Adams and is in his personal diary. So John Adams, while writing in his diary, comments, and I go right into describing the document in my own words without any quotes coming from the specific document itself. If I was to continue on with this paragraph, right? So now here I just talked about the struggling relationship between the branches of government, but my topic sentence also talks about the struggle between federal rights and state rights. So to answer your question, I can show you another example by saying, so if I ended this sentence by saying it's trying to diminish the role of the president, a similar struggle, because I want to connect the documents, right? Because this is all one paragraph. So I could say a similar struggle is represented by President Jackson in his farewell address when he discusses the changing relationship between the federal government, between the federal and state government. Jackson, as a Democrat, believes in the importance of states' rights, right? So I'm getting my exclamation point right there. In his farewell address, Jackson discusses how the empowering of the federal government leads to a loss of liberty for citizens. Document 4. So see, Ethan, how I did that there? I'm not quoting anything specifically, but I'm describing the document, I'm explaining the document, I'm supporting it in the sense of This is showing the political changes that are taking place, and all of that is being done without using any quotes. And I'm making a connection because this is important as well. You want to make sure if you're using multiple, because you're always going to use multiple documents within a paragraph, you want to make sure you connect them together. And I did that through this connecting sentence of saying a similar struggle is represented by President Jackson, because it's connecting it to the struggle that I just described above between the executive and legislative branches. So great question, Ethan. I appreciate you asking that. Any other questions that might be out there that I can answer about this? So this would be like my first body paragraph, right? I've basically just done my first body paragraph. I've described how politically there's been changes that have taken place between this time period of 1820 and 1848 using documents 1 and 4. At this point in time, now I have 2 other things in my thesis that I need to cover. So in my second body paragraph, I would pick up with one of those. And so in my second body paragraph, here I might want to make the argument about economics, how economically the country has changed. And so economically changed. And then here in this paragraph, I'm using 3 documents because remember, we're going to shoot for all 7 documents. And even though we only have to do 6 documents, just because it's a smart thing to do. But here again, I need to make sure I start the body paragraph with a topic sentence, right? So in this case, what we can say is, let me just go back and look. We're using, for economics, we are using documents 2, 3, and 5. And again, if there's more questions, I can steer away from what I'm doing to answer them. So in document 2, we see Tocqueville, who's talking about, let's see, each day he becomes, and one can say the man. So we're talking about Tocqueville, who is talking about how manufacturing is changing kind of the art of making a product, so to speak. So he's talking about the impact that the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing and everything like that is having on the actual artist. We also said for this one, we are going to use 2, 3. So we're going to use 3. So in this one, Chevalier is talking about, he's talking about speculators and the impact speculation is having on our country. And he's talking about speculation in many terms, so not just land speculators. And then I think we said the other one we're using is document 5, which is talking about a tariff. So we have a couple things going on here. We have basically technological changes that are being discussed. We have and technological changes in the terms of roadways, steamboats, technology in the form of industry, and then tariffs. So our topic sentence we might want to talk about here is United States was changing economically as new technology was introduced, and congressional laws were put into place to spur the economy. Right? So here we have our topic sentence, and now we've kind of set the scene of where this paragraph is going to go. And so then at this point in time, we will probably start off by talking about the first 2 documents. So start off by talking about Tocqueville, talking about the impact of industry, and then we can move into, there's a nice connection between him talking about the technological improvements and how it impacts the worker, to then moving into document 3 you can easily connect it to talking about Chevalier, who's also talking about technological impacts, not just in the industry itself, but technological impacts in farming, technological impacts as far as travel, and internal improvements, and how that impacts our country, and how all of this is being spurred. We can end this paragraph by talking about how all this is being spurred by the tariff policy that is being introduced by Congress and the protective tariffs that tend to benefit the North but hurt the South. And that would get us to that second body paragraph. After that, we would go into our third body paragraph, and then we end this all with a pretty conclusion, where in our conclusion, we would kind of restate our main points, again, talk about the fact that, the United States was super young at this point in time, but even being young, we still saw great changes taking place politically, economically, and socially in our country. Politically, we saw changing relationships occurring between the legislative and executive branch, as well as on the federal and state level. Economically, we saw changes due to new technological advancements that were impacting all aspects of the country, as well as tariff policies that tended to hurt one side of the country while improving the economy the other. And socially, we saw a lot of changes in our country during this time period due to more white men having the ability to vote, with still the exclusion of women. And then we're done with our DBQ, right? It seems so simple when you break it down like that. But then our DBQ is all over. I'm just going to go through kind of our ending things here, but if you have questions, comments, feel free to ask them. But just to let you know what's coming up next week. Next week on 11/11, you're going to have a stream on putting period 5 into context. We're getting closer and closer to the Civil War at this point in time. That'll be at 7 p.m. Central. Next Thursday, Antebellum America will be 11/14, 7 p.m. Central. And then, of course, here we are on social media at Think5able. You can reach us on Twitter. You can reach us on Instagram or on YouTube. Ask us questions. You can tell us topics you want us to cover. And then if anyone actually wants to finish this DBQ, feel free to submit it to Fiveable, and I would gladly give you my feedback on how you handled the rest of it. I know we covered we covered the first paragraph and the second paragraph, and started off our third paragraph and got the basics of the grouping and everything going. But if anybody wants personal feedback, please share, and I will gladly give it to you. Thank you so much for joining tonight. Thanks for the questions. And I hope to see you all again in another slide. Thank you and have a great night.